like I can ever convince Gary of anything, because he's not actually able to admit what I'm saying. He won't hear what I'm actually saying. He only hears, you know, an attempt to escape from what he thinks is true. So one of the things that you recognize when you discover the truth of relativity is that you learn to take the perspective of other agents in your environment, and I think escape the sort of solipsism that we're all capable of falling into. But I think Gary is a good example of someone that thinks they've figured it out, such that they have to refuse then to enter into any kind of a real dialogue with someone else, where a real dialogue would require taking on the perspective of that person's reality, instead of just refusing to admit that maybe they're right about something. Instead you've got the truth. I think Gary's kind of retreated a sort of strangely enough, he calls it objectivism, but I think it's really a kind of solipsism, at least in the sense that he thinks he's figured out the truth and that everybody else is wrong. Not just wrong, but stupid. And like willfully, he said about me that he thinks that I somehow know that it's all just random, purposeless matter colliding, and this game of the rat chasing the cheese that's unfolding, but then I try to pretend like there's more meaning to it than that. But that's not at all where I'm coming from. I don't agree with Gary that we have scientific knowledge about a mechanistic universe that's purposeless and blind. I think our scientific knowledge actually needs to be interpreted in a totally different way than Gary's interpreting it. And part of it has to do with taking seriously the way that reality is groundless, and that it's more about relationality. That's what relativity really, I think, entails, is a kind of relationality to things. And that whatever reality is, it's going to always be discovered in community. It's never going to be, if there is a truth, it's never going to be something that I have and that everyone else refuses to admit, or that someone else might disagree with. If there's truth, it's revealed because there's a community of beings that are participating in that event of truth being revealed, right? It's never just revealed to one separate mind. So I try to approach, unlike Gary, I think I try to approach dialogues with people not only open to the idea that a new truth might emerge between us, but that I expect that to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, then we're not really meeting each other. We're just remaining in our own solipsistic worldviews and refusing to break through and maybe recognize the agency of the other just as much as we recognize our own agency. So I guess there's like, I'd want to put ethics before ontology, before we talk about a reality, because usually reality means like it's independent of us or something. I'd want to talk about ethics and how we are to even enter into a conversation about reality. There's certain things that need to happen, ethical conditions that need to be met for us to even do philosophy together. And a lot of the times Gary's not willing to accept those ethical preconditions, I guess. Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, he grounds himself in an ethical proposition with supposed ethical premises, which I think could be reduced more than they are. Specifically his cannibalism addiction quad. And I keep attempting saying, well, you can still boil down all life as animation, that it's moving, that it's in a verbose as opposed to a nounous form. And and
Uh-huh.
try to objectify it in that sense of a moving, a transitional stages. Um, but I agree with most of what you're saying there. It's yeah, I noted that truth is mostly upon agreement, and so
Mm-hmm.
that requires the community. But I say mostly because at some point there seems as if there is one's exact interaction with their environment, which is where they find their ground, and that groundedness is a type of truth also. It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like Wittgenstein said, for a large class of cases, although not for all, the meaning of a word is found in its use. And he said that
Mm-hmm.
in the philosophical investigations. And so I was trying to figure out what the exception was, where he says, for all class of cases, but not for all. And when I hear that, that's when I'm like, okay, is he talking at that point about one's groundedness in their own environment, in their solipsistic environment, or is he talking about other forms of word propositions that are so exacted that you can't speak about them? They're so explicit that you can't
Yeah.
escape you can't maneuver them through use.
Maybe he was talking about mathematical physics, or something. The languages used by natural scientists, in the sense that they um, are they pertain to, like, mathematical descriptions of the physical world pertain to something that all human beings with the proper training would agree is true, and so there's no there should be in principle no community of intelligent beings that would disagree with mathematical propositions generated by physicists, as a result of experimental activity and um, sort of theoretical reflection, that there could be a language that we could arrive at that would be more than just about what human beings in their communities think is true, but about what is true of the universe itself. And I think I would want to preserve a kind of I think that what physics has told us about the world is true in some non-trivial sense. It's just a matter of, how we interpret that physics metaphysically. Given that physics has taught us about, you know, um, 14 or so billion years of cosmological unfolding and so on, what then are the preconditions for that process? Like, where do the so-called laws come from, and what is the quantum vacuum such that an entire universe could spontaneously emerge out of it? These are metaphysical questions that we can't do experiments to test.
Right.
And once you get there, I can start wondering what is really meant by community. And, I go to thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead, who would say that it's only human beings that have communities, human beings that participate in that sort of social interaction and transaction, and that it's only human communities that construct meaning, but that the universe itself is just full of these other non-human forms of community. The community of cells that makes up each of our bodies, like, or the community of stars that makes up the galaxy. Like, these are all societies of interacting agents. They have more or less agency. Like, maybe human beings have more agency than stars, or the black holes, the supermassive black holes at the center of galaxies. But there's clearly still some kind of agency at work at all of these levels of social organization. So, when I would say that truth is relative to a communal agreement, I would extend that beyond the human being and say that there are truths that we can learn about non-human communities that don't depend on what human communities think is true or not. You know, does that make any sense?
Yeah,
or
that
am I
does make
stretching the
sense.
word society and community a little too much for you?
Well, it's a bit of a stretch to speak about the agency of stars or non uh, I don't know, non-consciousness, but at the same time, I grant that. I grant a kind of a totality of, I mean, all stars have a gravity against us, and we have a gravity against them. So
Right.
there's a relational aspect. To what extent, I want to grant agency to a vegetable, to cabbage, for that example.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting, but I've always granted something to that organism. I've always granted, well, I shouldn't say always, but a great deal of time I've granted something about the vegetable is not only alive, but it's connective to us and that it's in our consciousness. And so what are we to it? And what are we to the mass amount of vegetation that's around us, or the mass amount of stars
Yeah.
that are around us? It's what to say about it is where I'm at a roadblock. In my most ecstatic kind of crazy man state, I granted consciousness to stars as if they were able to speak directly to me, and this was in a very maddened state, but nevertheless, granting that, and then having a difficult time cutting up a tomato, because here is a tomato in front of me, and here it is in all of its voluptuous plumptuousness. Here it is, liquid moving inside of it. All of that. Granted, I was really tentative about my relationship with consuming this vegetable, and I wasn't high on any drug. It was just more of a consideration about how to look at these things that we would generally not grant any agency to, and speaking about them as if they have an agency. And I don't know whether or not you run into a direct roadblock there. I would imagine there would be great criticism to grant agency there, but how do you maneuver around that when you speak about community of the cosmos?
Well, it's obviously more difficult to describe the agency of plants than it is to describe the agency of, say, human beings or even the agency of animals, because plants they're not animate in the sense that we don't see them moving around seemingly fulfilling desires that they have to act in the world to accomplish certain things, right? Plants sort of just sit there.
Mm-hmm.
But just because it's more difficult to describe the agency of plants doesn't mean that plants don't have agency. We have to feel into they live in at a different rate of the passage of time, right? So to see the agency of plants, we have to try to slow ourselves down a little bit. And, we can do this with modern technology and pretty easily with, time-lapse photography, and watch a plant in its sort of expansion and contraction as it grows from seed to stalk to leaf, to bud to flower to fruit. Like there's this seemingly teleological movement where a plant moves from a nascent state to a fully developed state and accomplishes a goal. Like, let's say a tomato plant exists for the sake of creating tomatoes, right? And its agency is expressed through that process of development. Now, it's easy to slide into a kind of intelligent design interpretation of what I'm saying here, and I don't want to slide into that, because I don't think that anyone designed the tomato and said that this plant has been created by some intelligent being for the purposes of creating tomatoes to feed us. Rather, I think there's an evolutionary process whereby human beings have cultivated this particular plant and helped to coax it towards a particular form of expression, and that through millions of years of coevolution, there came to be a plant that made tomatoes for human beings. But I think that it is possible to begin to get at and express what the agency of plants is like. It's not like the agency of animals. And I even think we can start to get at what the agency of something like, the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy. I think, if you look at what astrophysicists are telling us about the history of our universe and the way that these supermassive black holes came to be, they describe this sort of process of feedback whereby a certain balance is achieved by the black hole in relation to the amount of gas from the surrounding galaxy that it sucks into itself versus these periodic sort of explosions, and we can see through telescopes other galaxies where there are these like concentric rings of gas around the center of that universe where the black hole is, and it's a result of this this feedback loop whereby the bigger the black hole gets, the more gas it sucks into itself, but then the bigger the explosion is when it lets that gas off again. So that in the galaxies that do support stars, it's because a certain, Goldilocks temperature has been maintained as a result of this feedback loop the black hole moves through. So when you begin to think of the galaxy in this way, it starts to seem a lot like a self-organizing system, in the same way that cellular life is self-organizing, and multicellular life is self-organizing. It's a different, maybe it's not as high octane a form of self-organization in the sense that it has sensory organs and limbs to accomplish goals like animals can, but clearly there's a kind of a process of self-maintenance and self-production going on here that to me is similar enough in kind to what living creatures do that we should describe it as, in some sense, alive or in possession of agency, as basic as it may be.
When you see wind funneling dust in the air, I mean, you could reduce it to something like that. Like, to what extent do you grant agency to the inorganic as it's moving about, planetarily speaking? It doesn't seem as if that would be too far off or dissimilar to describing the cosmos as having a teleology of sorts without, trying to see movement and animation and granting a crossing over, blending or conflating the word agency to overlap into that description is, I think it's a needed description for philosophy. I think there needs to be a place to describe what it is when someone is talking about that, and perhaps that is just cosmology. But what to say about it other than just to describe it is what's in question. What is it that one wants to say about these events that is other than just a description of their animation?
Well, I think part of what I'm getting at by attributing agency to these systems that we normally don't attribute agency to is that at our particular moment in history, with human beings causing the sixth great mass extinction event and climate change, and that there's a real threat now that not only will human beings undermine the very conditions for the possibility of their own civilization, but they'll take a lot of other species. We're going to take a lot of other species with us as we go extinct, drive ourselves into extinction. And I think in that situation, if there's any hope of our survival, it's because we're able to come into ethical relationship with agencies other than our own. And
I see.
Like right now, our economic system is kind of solipsistic. Like, if neoliberal capitalism is predicated upon the idea that each of us is a sort of atomic individual that it's as if we were sort of one day drawn up out of the mud and fully formed and entered into the world just as an autonomous, rational actor, forgetting the fact that actually we're born out of mothers into families and have communities, and that, you know, to be an individual human being is already to be in community with um, other human beings, and we don't enter into the world as a solipsistic atom, right? That kind of an economic system, I think, stems from our inability to enter into ethical relationship with other human beings, first of all, but also with other forms of agency in our surrounding world. It's really a lot easier to enter into and to recognize the agency of other non-human forms of life when you're on psychedelics, right? Because it drops that cultural, ideological veil that clouds our perception of what we actually experience around us. And
Do you?
I think the reason
I was going to interrupt you there.
uh,
I was just curious if do you think language is intrinsically hierarchical, or do you view it that it's both hierarchical and it's non-hierarchical? I mean, it sounds as
I
if.
think,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, if I said language was rhizomatic, would that have meaning to you? No, it's more of a network, and sometimes the network becomes hierarchical, but it's not always that way, and sometimes there can be a linguistic hierarchy that gets destroyed when it comes into contact with some other aspect of language, and then all of a sudden you have a more level playing field again. So language is very fluid. It can be hierarchical and non-hierarchical. Yeah.
As you were describing the economic solipsism and that non-relation to planetary communities, I was thinking of a large pyramid on a sphere, and the sphere being like the world, and the pyramid being those who are involved in a certain economic hierarchy, and that it's stretching away. So many people don't belong to the pyramid because they're on the sphere, and then so many people are engaged in the pyramid or the hierarchy of the economics. And it just makes me think about hierarchies in language, because I wondered, and I dabble in the idea of sentence structure. You know, I had argued with Anton about the Piraha not having a non-recursive language and non-hierarchical processing where you can't envelop one sentence into the other, and that was a disclosure of a primitive form of interaction, which I don't think is off base with what it is you're talking about communities that live outside of hierarchical structures, economic structures. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, there's something about industrial capitalism that eliminates the possibility of that kind of more primordial or traditional, you know, tribal experience of the world. That most primal peoples are able to experience the natural world and, you know, other creatures on the earth and the stars in the sky and the planets overhead. I mean, they experience all of those natural beings as animate and in the possession of agency. And whatever industrial capitalism is, it definitely involves a sort of vacuuming up of all of that agency out there in nature and the gathering it up into the human being, and that so that the human being becomes the only source of agency and purpose and value in the universe, such that, you know, for lands to have any value, it must be owned by some human being. And this is liberal philosophy going back to John Locke, right? Like in a state of nature, there's no value. That the value comes from the way that the human being takes it and produces it. into something to be sold in the marketplace, right? This is the same, it's really a metaphysics, right? Because it denies agency to everything else and says only the human is in possession of agency. This is what allowed colonialists to justify their activity. Like, my favorite part of Ayn Rand's, my favorite implication is that when she's asked in an interview about the Europeans coming over to North America and interacting with the native population here, that she said that because they didn't know what a land deed was, that they actually didn't own the land, and so the colonists, the Europeans, didn't even have to pretend like they were trading to acquire these lands. They just took them and had every right to take them because the people that lived on the continent already weren't rational, didn't have law and, you know, paperwork that would say that a human being owns something. For them, for the native populations, the land belongs to Gaia, like to Mother Earth. Human beings don't belong, or human beings don't belong, the land doesn't belong to human beings. Human beings belong to the land. You know, so the agency for most traditional peoples, I think, is certainly externalized, or at least we modern people think of it as though they're just projecting their own agency onto the world. But I don't think they're projecting it. I think they actually experience it that way, and that our perception as modern people is distorted, and that we're the ones that are projecting. We're projecting mechanism. We're projecting our own understanding of our technologies onto a natural world that isn't just dead and external and purposeless, but that you know, in the first place was the source of all the meaning that human language ever had. Like, I think, you know, when the Semitic peoples and the Phoenicians created the alphabet several thousand years ago, it's the same. It's the basis for all of our languages today. When they created that first, in the West at least, when they created that first alphabet, and even before that, when the first human beings learned to speak, I think they learned this from other animals, and they learned it from, you know, paying close attention to the movements of the planets through the fixed constellations. You know, where the planets, if you look at the alphabet, the early alphabets, there's actually a correspondence between vowels and consonants and the way that they fit together into meaningful sentences, and the way that planets move through fixed constellations, where the planets are like the vowels and the fixed constellations are the consonants. So, you know, human beings nowadays with our supposedly self-reflective, rational, logical intelligence, we don't often, if we look at history, I think we realize how often we forget that all of our logic and science and stuff is embedded in this language that we learned from the world around us. You know, it wasn't given to us by God, by some transcendent designer of the universe. We learned it from the universe. You know?
Yeah, that shifts my mystical experiences back to a naturalism, as opposed to a solipsistic mysticism.
Yes.
And that's fine for me to view them that way. But when I view them that way, I'm still left with these objective fissures that allowed for these experiences to come through, which seemingly extend beyond science's descriptability or controllability. And I'm not certain if I want to go anywhere into that, because I like your educational background as far as looking at the consonants and vowels relative to constellations and movements. If you wanted to expound on how the animal sounds and influence language based on what you've learned, that would be fine. I wouldn't mind hearing that.
I have to actually leave very shortly.
I see.
I can give you some books that would really unpack that for you. Have you ever heard of David Abram? He's um, he's both a stage magician, it's his day job, and then he also writes. He's a philosopher and writes books on sort of phenomenology of nature, you might say. He wrote a book called The Spell of the Sensuous, which is about how language evolved through the course of human history. It's really quite profound. Um, and I'll shoot you a link to a lecture, transcribed a lecture by this fellow Rudolf Steiner. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he has a lot to say about specifically how language, the first alphabets were structured to correspond with the movements of planets through constellations. It's really far out there, but I think it makes a lot of sense, especially hearing a little bit about some of your psychedelic experiences and thinking that stars are conscious. You might find it interesting if you're
Sure.
if you're mad or you've experienced that sort of madness before.
Right.
So yeah, I'll shoot you that link, but I should probably sign off.
Okay. Okay. No, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we'll do it again more, and next time we can record some of it.
Yeah, maybe we'll even have Gary in the room.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
I love that.
Okay.
All right, what's your name actually, if you don't?
It's Mike Fail. It's Mike Fail. My last name is Fahl.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I'm Matt Segall. I know you knew that, but nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
Good to talk.
You too.
Take it easy.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. Well, that was the end of interaction with Matt Segall. Thou art that, and hopefully this video processes, because that was a nice and light, wafty conversation that I really, really thought was good. It was a good one. Okay, bye. Mohawk.